Welcome everyone to our third event for this year's Woods Hole Black History Month program. We will be discussing A Beautiful Resistance, curated by Jeneé Osterheldt, who we have here with us. So just a few quick basic mechanics of this meeting. For those in the audience, your audio is muted and your cameras are off, and they will be for the duration of the event. Please feel free to ask any questions at any point during the event using the Q&A chat function. Our Black History Month committee member, Megan Hannawalt, will be monitoring that for us. I'll now turn it over to Rob Thieler, Director of the USGS Woods Hole Coastal and Marine Center and Chair of the Woods Hole Diversity Initiative, to offer some brief remarks about the Woods Hole Diversity Initiative.
Hi, thank you, Anji. Good afternoon. My name is Rob Thieler. I'm the Center Director of the U.S. Geological Survey's Coastal Marine Science Center here in Woods Hole, and currently the chair of the Woods Hole Diversity Initiative. Welcome to the Woods Hole scientific community's ongoing 40th anniversary celebration of Black History Month. In 2004, the leaders of the 6 Woods Hole Science institutions, the Marine Biological Laboratory, the NOAA Northeast Fisheries Science Center, Sea Education Association, USGS, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and the Woodwell Climate Research Center signed a memorandum committing our institutions to work together to attract and retain a more diverse workforce. That memorandum established the Woods Hole Scientific Community Diversity Initiative, which in turn established the Diversity Advisory Committee to support the institutions in their efforts to promote diversity and inclusion in and among the Diversity Initiative institutions, as well as the wider Woods Hole, Cape Cod and Islands communities, and increasingly, due to moving things online during the pandemic, the nation and the world. On behalf of the Diversity Initiative, I'd like to thank our local virtual host, the Woodwell Climate Research Center, the Woods Hole Diversity Advisory Committee, especially the Black History Month Committee and co-chairs Anji Scott-Price and Larry Alade, for putting together another outstanding series of events, including this one today that I'm really looking forward to. Thank you again for attending today, and I'm pleased to turn things back over to Anji.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for joining us. So again, I want to acknowledge my co-chair, Dr. Larry Alade, and the entire Black History Month committee that worked really hard and worked well together to put together this month's events. A special thanks to Megan Hannawalt and Lindsay Scott for choosing A Beautiful Resistance as part of our series programming. I'd also want to acknowledge the 6 research institutions that provide monetary and in-kind support for our events: the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, the Marine Biological Laboratory, the NOAA Northeast Fisheries Science Center, the USGS Coastal Marine Center, and the Sea Education Association. And a special thank you to Woodwell Climate Center for hosting this specific event today. So now to the fun stuff. So I'd like to welcome Jeneé Osterheldt, a culture columnist who covers identity and social justice through the lens of culture and the art. Her work centers Black lives and the lives of people of color. She joined the Boston Globe in 2018 and is the creator of A Beautiful Resistance. So thank you so much for being with us today. And I'd also like to introduce Gwyneth Packard. Most people probably know Gwyneth. She is a wonderful member of our Falmouth community, senior engineer at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and one of the leaders of Engage Falmouth. She's also one of the founders of the Supper Club, which is very special to my heart here in Falmouth. So first, I want to just ask Jeneé a couple questions specifically about A Beautiful Resistance. Could you share a little bit with us about your motivation behind the series?
Well, I have been covering identity and social justice for a long time, way before I came to the Boston Globe. And when George Floyd died, by that time, I had covered Black Lives Matter since before we even used those words. And I was just exhausted. And I went to Minneapolis. I was there for the funeral. I was there at the intersection where he was lynched to witness the memorial that everybody had built. And it was just a really hard time. It was still early in the pandemic. And in Minneapolis at that time, due to the protest, there was heavy police presence. There was curfew at 7 p.m. You couldn't even catch a Uber, a Lyft. All of the restaurants and businesses were closed. It was really hard to get a meal. Even the hotel I stayed at, the restaurant only opened up for 4 hours a day. And if you didn't get food during that time, it was just a hard time. And when I got back to Boston, I was pretty emotionally depleted, and I'm single. So, you can't hug anybody, you can't see anybody, you can't really mourn the way you usually mourn. And I needed a way to wrap my arms around our people and to just give a hug and to also say we're more than this. We are not hashtags and dead bodies. Like, we are fully beautiful, joyous, living people who deserve to be celebrated while we're here and not just memorialized in death. And that's really how A Beautiful Resistance was born. I wanted to make sure that we got the story right. And I feel like we've been so disempowered by the media because the media focuses on largely the brutality and injustice or extreme excellence. So there's no room for Black humanity.
Wow, that's beautifully put and definitely understandable. We often don't see Black joy in Black families portrayed positively, if at all. So I understand that. What has the feedback been like from people?
People have mostly been really happy and excited. And I think a lot of people, because we are in a pandemic, really two pandemics, the pandemic of coronavirus and America's original pandemic, which is racism supremacy. And I think because the news is very much focused on that, and it really should be like this is what we're living in. But I think things are so ugly, hard, and dark that people seeing joy and seeing the soft parts and the tender parts has been good for all of us. It's been therapeutic. So mostly great feedback. I mean, I have gotten hate mail my entire career, no matter what I write about. So there's still racist, hateful feedback, but overall it's been good.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. I know I've really enjoyed it. I watched several of the episodes multiple times, especially the first one on Martha's Vineyard, because I live here on the Cape.
Yeah.
I don't think I've been to Inkwell. I feel like if I had actually been to the beach, I would know if I had been there. So I haven't been there yet, but it definitely really evoked a sense of like I need to go to this place. I need to experience it for myself. Yeah.
It's the tiny stretch of beach. It's like this little small stretch of beach, but it's ours and it's pretty beautiful.
Yeah. So Gwyneth, what have you thought about the series?
I was really struck by that first one as well. So I'm Black, white, biracial. My mother's family is Black. My father's family is white. And my mother's family has a history of going to the vineyard, staying in Oak Bluffs for decades. And my cousins from New York who come up, their friends come up. So when we go to visit them there, it's joyful because we're not the only family that looks like us with pale members and dark members, but also they'll be waving to other people from New York, the whole neighborhood's up. And they stay in Black owned businesses with, Afrocentric decorations, and we just can be there. And so that's what really struck me is that, as you were saying, so much of the time, what gets centered is our trauma, and to be able to relax, to be able to laugh, to be able to experience, grabbing the brass rings on the flying horses and swimming, which is like a whole other thing, right? Whether or not we can swim and whether we can be like, just be together in family joy has been one of the highlights of my life. And so for the first episode to start there was really refreshing and grounding in a year that has been so draining and destructive.
Yeah. So speaking of families, as we said, when families are not usually Black families are not usually depicted in the best ways. And so Inkwell is a place that, as described in episode 1, and as Gwyneth just said, a place of Black joy and family time. What are some other places in y'all's lives where you find that sense of Black joy, and what makes those places unique?
I think there's a lot of places that we just don't, they're not the Inkwell and, Martha's Vineyard, but then there's Sag Harbor, and, there's places in South Carolina and Virginia where Black people go to luxuriate. But I also like to think of places like, my favorite brunch spot where I go and it's not just me and my table of Black girlfriends and everyone else is white. I go to DC and I go to brunch and it's just all beautiful Black people. There's a DJ playing Beyonce and Cardi B, and everyone has champagne and it's like a bad boy video, and it's delightful because it's a way, it's like, here we are being our whole selves. No one's judging us or saying we're too loud or we shouldn't be dancing, or I can actually eat chicken and waffles and dance at the same time without it being a stereotype. It's those moments, every HBCU campus. I'm a HBCU graduate of Norfolk State University, and homecoming is, if there was not a pandemic, I would have done a whole episode on homecoming. Like, homecoming is the most special thing to me. And being able, anyone who graduated from HBCU, homecoming is special no matter if you are 80 years old or if you are 15 and you're going with your big brother or big sister. It's just like nothing you've ever seen, because it's everybody from all over the diaspora loving on each other and having a good time. And it's just, you get a whole weekend of it. It's not a day, it's a whole full weekend of just Black celebration. And to me, that's one of the most undersung spaces of Black joy. But mostly, I think there's tender, tiny little small places that we overlook within our neighborhoods and communities that are the birthplaces and cultivators of Black joy.
Yeah. Here on the Cape, there's very few places that you can find where you're not going to be the only one. So Gwyneth, have you found any spaces here on the Cape or anywhere else that you travel to?
Not really on the Cape, and that's why we made Supper Club, was to have, and we're making virtual spaces now. So I had just joined Black and Marine Science, which was started by Tiara Moore, and then just this week, a guy from Scripps, Steve Diggs, and I started Black in Oceanography as a virtual space for us to just be our whole selves. And chat casually there. So we're making more virtual spaces, but you really do find that joy when you're in a space that's not just default predominantly white. And it is something I don't get a lot up here in New England, and I typically experience when I go home, which, I haven't since the pandemic started. But most of my family is in Baltimore. And so when I go there, I find a lot more casual joy that you don't have to deliberately seek out and construct.
Yeah. So I did not attend an HBCU. I went to a very, very white university. And it was interesting because I had seen mostly Spike Lee movies, where they talk about homecoming and how great it was. And homecoming at my school was nothing at all like that. But then I worked at an HBCU for a few years and I got to experience what homecoming was like. And I was like, oh, This is it. This is what they're talking about. Like, this is amazing. And like you said, just to be, and things aren't a stereotype, and to have fun was, and I didn't even attend there. I'd worked there. So I was kind of like, am I supposed to be participating? And everyone's like, no, come on, Anji.
No,
like
everybody's welcome.
Everybody. And that was absolutely
a cookout.
Yeah, it was a giant cookout. Oh, it was so much fun. And as much as I do love living here on the Cape, I do miss those kinds of things. I miss those communities. We have our own community. We've got some great allies here, but sometimes it's not quite the same.
No, New England, to Gwyneth's point, New England is a place where Black people and people of color have to create spaces. And, my hat's off to people in Boston like Farah Belazar and Sheena Collier, who actively create spaces for Black people to congregate and have fun together. But yeah, space has to be created. And sometimes it's crazy. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around, because Boston in particular is, 25% Black. It's also 25% immigrant and, at least 20% Asian and 23% Latinx. So it's a predominantly not white city or metro area, but the power structure is so complicit in supremacy, and the housing structure is so messed up that optically it's what it looks like. Everyone's so hidden and separated and segregated thanks to redlining and gentrification and transportation and all these issues that we have to literally fight and build constructs for community, which is really sad.
It definitely is. So speaking of housing and generational things, generational housing and generational wealth are not things that Black families have been traditionally afforded because of things you mentioned, like redlining, amongst many other things that we won't argue or go into. But what is the importance of us as Black people having and building generational wealth and housing for our families?
You know, there'll be people who will say, oh, you know, we can't buy our way out of racism. And we can't. Like Serena, Beyonce, Oprah, we have watched all of them deal with highly racist things, and they are the richest Black people in the world.
Can you say that again for the people in the back?
You know, we can't, like, we cannot buy our way out of supremacy. But I also am not going to argue that Jay-Z's wrong about the importance of being able to navigate a capitalistic system. Like, I'm not saying we should be out here like celebrating a capitalistic system, but until we dismantle it, we have to live in it, navigate it, and survive in it. And owning land has been one of the easiest ways for white people to amass wealth, or at least stability. Even if they're not super rich, they have a sense of stability and steadiness that many Black and brown people do not have.
Right.
And it's very sad to me how we are watching lots and lots of Black people who had homes, you know, whose grandma or great grandma had a little house in a neighborhood that wasn't much, but it was theirs. And then big companies come and decide they're going to buy that whole community up, and people do what they have to do to survive. And then the people who live there get displaced. I mean, we're seeing it in Roxbury and all over. It's why Boston looks how it looks when you go into the like downtown and into a lot of the the neighborhoods. Like, they've been so gentrified, and you know, there were people there who owned homes. There were Black people there who had triple deckers, and you know, the way the structure has gone is we've been so disempowered. And what Mercy did, um, her and her brother did in Vineyard Haven, buying that home, not just buying a home, but buying property, buying land so that they can expand, and making kind of a vow to never ever sell it, to never ever let it go, to only make it better, so that anyone in their bloodline will always have a home and will never be displaced. That is a different kind of freedom. No, it doesn't save you from racism, but it does offer you respite, which is something we don't have a lot of, respite and stability. So it's like, if I have to navigate a racist country in a you know, supremacy every day, having a home to go to that is mine, having space where I can help my family, where like, I grew up as a latchkey kid. I grew up getting evicted, changing schools every other year. So I know what it's like to be housing unstable or to not have a permanent address. So when I saw what Mercy did and how her and her brother literally put all their pennies together and did everything they could just to buy this, it's like, they're not rich. Like, they did everything they could, and they're like, we're going to buy this and we're going to build this. I think we have to start thinking about generational wealth, not as in mansions and in Balenciaga and all this stuff, but as in stability, safety, and respite. And that can look like a small house, or a, you know, it doesn't have to be grand. It just has to be safe and yours.
Yeah, absolutely. When
I think sometimes about when I'm thinking about this problem about my grandma Jeneé, my mom's mom, who went at the time I'm thinking, I was around middle school. She was living in Harlem, and her apartment, I remember visiting her. I don't remember how many locks she had on her door. And I remember when I found out that she had been broken into and cleaned out 3 times. And, you know, here she has this job. She's occasionally buying, I think most of what she would buy would be gold jewelry to wear, and then it would be gone. And so thinking about like that was what she was trying to sort of invest is too grand a word, but like, she, you know, the wealth that she held was in something that was portable and not safe and was wiped out 3 times. And so when you talk about safety, when you talk about respite, when you talk about generational wealth, I just think, you know, other people get broken into, but each time she was broken into, it wasn't just necklaces that went away, it was she had to start again.
Yeah. So when Andre, my husband, and I moved back up here to the Cape permanently, and the long story about how we first tried to rent a place, we were discriminated against. And so when we were able to buy our house, we said our house is going to be a safe space for people of color. And pre-COVID, we were hosting like informal little parties of people of color that we learned lived in Woods Hole. We were like, hey, you should come hang out, come have a safe space, and let's cook our cultural foods and just kind of hang out and just to have a safe space, because especially here on the Cape, the cost of housing is absurd, especially in the last 8 months during the pandemic. And so we understand that that's a barrier for a lot of people who look like us to get here. And I mean, to, you know, to get here in general, but to stay. So a question that we received from an audience member before the event is based on episode 5, which is about the Black Bostonians and gentrification. And the question was, I assume that there was much protest over the demolition of the Tubman House and the disrespect inherent in the erasure of that important cultural and social space. Do we know the owners of that property who sold it, and what sort of efforts were made by community groups to raise funds to preserve it?
You can totally Google all of this, but the group that sold it, I'm blanking on the name right now. It's like the South End. I can pull up my email, but it's a Black woman that helps run this group. And she's very adamant about letting people know that it's not destroyed forever, it's relocated, which it had been relocated before. What I wish people would talk about is, while I realize Black people made that sale and they're relocating the Tubman House, is it doesn't change the fact that it had to be sold and relocated due to gentrification, due to what's happening in the neighborhood. So it's not a vilification of the Black people involved in the sale any more than it's a vilification of anyone's granny who sells their tripper decker in Dorchester because they got to survive and move on when the gentrifiers come and offer them more money than they've ever seen. I understand that, but I wish people could get out of their egos and understand this isn't about attacking you for selling. It's about why, what conditions led to this, and what conditions led to a neighborhood that used to be predominantly Black, that used to be a cultural hub, that used to be the home of like Harlem Renaissance musicians and artists and abolitionists, which now when you go, you don't see anyone who really looks like you, or if you do, they're in a very inequitable and unjust situation. So that's part of it, but the house is being relocated. There were Black people involved in this sale. That's probably not the rich answer, like the very soulful answer anyone was looking for, but for me, it's about us talking about what's happening in Boston on a larger scale that leads to these types of things, or that leads, I mean, the Dart Adams episode was so important to me because Dart was able to point at so many places of Black history that no one knows exist because they're not preserved in any way. There's no tenderness or thoughts of how can we cherish and preserve these spaces of like I think a basketball court where Martin Luther King played ball is so important. Like to talk about, like, this man wasn't just in jail and speeches and a reverend. He was a whole human who played ball and had fun and it talked mess. And, you know, Coretta wasn't even into him at first because she thought he was short. You know, just all this type of stuff. And it's just like, we don't have the markers. We don't know that, like, some of the earliest Black brunches happened here in Boston, you know, at places like Bob the Chef's and Mother's Lunch, or that Sammy Davis Jr. was a soda jerk here. Like, these are things, they're spaces that should be preserved with love. Like, not just like a tiny plaque that you can hardly see, but actually preserved with love. Like, Malcolm X worked here and briefly lived here. And he lived here when he was Malcolm X, but he also lived here when he was Malcolm Little and like acting crazy, which are the things that informed him later becoming who he became. And we do have other memorials to Harriet Tubman, but a house, particularly a house that was a community hub for neighborhood children, it's not as easy as like, we'll just relocate it. Like, we have to start thinking about space and markers a lot differently than, oh, I can just move this thing and it'll be okay. And we also have to think, when things do have to be relocated, why is this happening? And how are we fighting the things that are creating this upheaval and this lack of permanency, particularly for Black and Brown spaces?
And this ties into why it's so important for Black and Brown people to tell their own stories, because the outside looking in, I can understand where this question comes from. It's like, oh, this is so tragic, why would they do this? But not understanding, why did they feel that they needed to do this? Why was this something that obviously I can't imagine that it was easy for anybody to say, oh, we're just going to move this. So yeah, I think it really speaks to why it's so important for us to tell our own stories, because you only get half truths and part of the story when you're not the one telling it.
And it's just complicated. It's one of those things that's complicated. Like I love to use the example of the grandmas, the grandmas who sell their tiny houses that could be in the family forever, but Black people don't have the stability to always hold on to that. So when an opportunity comes and someone's like, hey, I'll give you 500,000 for a house that's probably worth millions, and they don't know it because the neighborhood doesn't look like it's worth millions, but a big company is going to come and make it that way. And they're like, well, this can feed the family, but it really can't. It could feed the family for a little while. We have so much compounded trauma, and so much of our decision making is things that have to be made in the moment and can't be made for the long term.
Yeah, we don't always have that privilege of being able to make decisions for the long term.
No.
Yeah.
And I think it's meaningful to think about what it means going into a future where this space will not hold space for this history, which is not just Black history, but American history. And for that to be erased, what does that mean? That area is going to move, that the developer maybe wants to move in a direction where there isn't room for this story to be told there in that space anymore. Yeah.
All of it's just such a function of supremacy and the erasure of Black history from American history, and really all people of color history from America. All of us, like Toni Morrison said, all of us have to hyphenate. The only people that get to just be American are white people. Everyone else has to hyphenate. And it's indicative in how the greater society tells their stories. It's why, to Angie's point, like, we have to be the keepers of our stories. We have to tell our stories, and we can't just tell stories of overcoming suffering and brutality and violence. Those are part of our story, but I don't want us to be measured that way. And I think measuring a people that way dehumanizes them and disempowers them. And Bell Hooks, in an essay, had said, working within community, whether it be sharing a project with another person or with a larger group, we are able to experience joy in the struggle. The joy needs to be documented. If we only focus on the pain, the difficulties which are real in any process of transformation, we only show a partial picture. So we don't tell a full truth when we erase a people's joy, when we erase a people's lived experience, when we take away their homes and their community hubs and their parks and just act like it never happened. We decimate their truth and their reality. And part of all of this is why I created A Beautiful Resistance, because we have to have that dedication and love of self and of each other. And it doesn't just, something that I've heard people say about A Beautiful Resistance that I don't like is, when this is so beneficial to our people, and it is, I absolutely meant it as a love letter to us, but this is beneficial to all people. This is not, it doesn't just do us well when we see ourselves reflected. It does people who don't look like us well. It is a gift and a delight for everyone to see our joy and our beauty, not to like quote everyone to death, but you know, Audre Lorde said the sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between the sharers, which can be the basis of much of what is misunderstood. So the sharing of joy lessens the threat of their differences. So this is good for all of us, and this is all of our story. And until we start being able to see that in each other, we're going to just continue to be trying to keep our shoulders off the mat as we wrestle supremacy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm wondering about, speaking of stories, there is a question that's come in that's from Jennifer Morgan, saying that the stories you chose to highlight in A Beautiful Resistance were extraordinary. There must have been other examples to choose from. Can you tell us a bit about your process for the curation and how you made those choices?
Oh, I mean, there's a never ending list of stories to choose from. There's no shortage of beautiful Black stories to tell. I keep a running list of, I've kept a list of people that I meet, stories that I hear since I started in 2018. As a columnist, I can't always tell those stories. So I just keep a list, which is why when I decided to create these series, I knew it didn't take me any time to decide, oh, I'm starting with Mercy Bell. I had met Mercy a year and a half prior and in a workout class. And she followed me on Instagram afterwards. And then I followed her back because that's what we do on social media. And I saw like, oh my God, she's at the Vineyard a lot. So I asked, I was like, hey, like I heard that you might have a house on the Vineyard. I was like, can I talk to you about that? So I had like a 2-hour conversation with her, but it was out of season was ending. And my editor was like, let's wait on that. And we waited, and I just didn't get to do it. And when my opportunity came, I was like, oh, we're opening this series with Mercy Bell, because I always was enamored with her story. And so I just knew that I was going to open with that. And part of the choices, all of the people deserve to have their stories told, but some of there were other stories, but we're living in a pandemic and life is always lifing. So there's some people that I couldn't link up with because it is a pandemic and coronavirus, and some people were living with their parents, and a lot of decisions had to be made based on safety. But everybody was on there's no one that got featured that wasn't on my list. And that's the beauty about having this never ending list of people, is that if something doesn't work out, I don't kick a person off the list. I'm just like, revisit them and see if life is going to let us have this moment together later. But each of them were people that I had either met at an event or had a conversation with or gotten a quote from for a different kind of a story, but was like, man, this person's interesting. I want to lean more into their story. Or serendipity, like OJ Slaughter, that was serendipity. I was at a protest, and I tell this story in the video. Like, I was at a protest protesting, living my best Black life, and someone tagged me on Instagram later, and OJ Slaughter had photographed me, and I was like, I don't even remember this picture being taken, and it was a picture of my favorite moment of that protest. And then, you know, I'm like, OJ's this, I had read about OJ before. I was like, this is this like celebrated Black photographer who's doing this important work. So I just started following OJ and wanting to work with OJ. And I was like, I want to tell OJ's story about what it is, you know, the work of James Van Der Zees and Gordon Parks. And though Frederick Douglass was not a photographer, Frederick Douglass wielded the tool of photography better than most. And I think about the work all of them did in telling our truth. And I look at what OJ is doing and making sure that they capture what's really happening at protest, and not just destruction or violence, but joy, community, love, and actual pictures of who the real perpetrators are at the events. It's important. So that's how OJ came to be. And the only other person that wasn't on my original list is Krista Scruggs. And that again was like kind of serendipity. A sommelier that I knew in Kansas City DM'd me and was like, oh my God, when you get a chance, you should go to Vermont to this Black owned winery. And she wasn't even trying to get me to do a story on Krista. She was just like, you would love it. And I was like, there's a Black owned winery in Vermont. And then I like went to Krista's Instagram and I was like, oh my God, this person is a badass. Like, I have to meet this person. This is going to be the season finale. Like, I hadn't even laid out all of the episodes in total, but I knew the first one would be water and the last one would be land. I knew that I would open with Mercy and close with Krista. Everything else was just, who am I going to pull from to who's going to dance well in this season. And I like to remind people, that was the first season. This is not a one-off. It's not like, oh, well, those are the only 6 stories you're going to see. We're already doing Black History Month stories right now. On Instagram, we have little short stories every day. So everyone on my list, I am sure, will eventually get their turn. And if they don't, then I just pass their names to other coworkers, like, hey, you should probably do a profile on this person. They're kind of cool. But that's a little bit about my process, was, you know, people that I had been wanting to see amplified that had not been amplified because there was no, like Che, I wanted to write about Che literally my first month at the Globe, but there was no news peg, and Che is in Worcester. So there's this Boston attitude of Worcester. And I didn't have a direct news peg. And with A Beautiful Resistance, I was free of that. I didn't need to tie it to a news peg. I didn't need to say, and now I'm going to weave this into some great big story on something else. I could just let him be Black Boy Joy. And London, I had actually seen perform at a brunch and had made a note like, oh, I should do a story on London eventually in this group that he's in. And then I kind of forgot, because I write so much that sometimes I just forget things. And then the pandemic comes and I'm binge watching TV like crazy, the way all of us do. And then London's on my TV and I was like, oh my God. I sent an email and was like, hey, London, are you back in Boston yet? And he's like, yeah. And it was just that easy. I was like, hey, can we meet up? I think I want you to be involved in this thing I'm doing. So
Nice.
it all just came together quite nicely. And it wasn't always easy, and lots of curveballs came because, again, COVID, and, you know, I had to get tested all the time, and making sure that we're like a certain amount of distance apart. And, you know, I didn't have a glam squad, so sometimes I look crazy in the video. It's just, you know, it's a lot of
Wonderful.
You know, like new school rules to make sure we're all staying very healthy, but still doing the work that is necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to ask you something about specifically about episode 6 with Krista. So she mentions in her interview that she is the first Black winemaker in Vermont, I think it was. And she said usually when people come to talk to her, they don't really want to talk about her wine. They want to talk about her being the first or her being the only. And so I'm curious if, you know, that tends to overshadow things that we do as Black people. Like you mentioned earlier about the media focusing a lot on our trauma, but then also like the exceptionals, the only, the first. So how do we embrace those of us who may be some sort of trailblazer without losing sight of ourselves? And this is definitely a question for both of you.
Gwyneth, do you want to go? I feel like I've been talking a lot.
I don't really have an answer. I've been thinking a lot about, you know, the lessons that I internalized as a child, that I would have to be twice as good to get half as much, and the whole idea of having to excel because you had to be unassailable, because if you had a chink, you know, that was it, you get derailed. So I've been thinking about that a lot lately. And you know, I was on a call yesterday about Black excellence in oceanography out at Scripps, and the one of the students talked about how not being able to show you having to be very level during conversations. And I thought about how we end up doing that. I'll get complimented sometimes for being so patient or so calm, and I'm like, that is a survival trait, because that at this point isn't even a conscious choice. It's more of the consequences in the back of my mind if I don't do that are that I will lose this opportunity or lose this, I'll lose my message. I know that's not quite speaking to what you were talking about, but I've been the only in the room for so long. I miss the idea of being able to relax into not knowing something or making a mistake or being just fully human. I'm sorry, I don't think I'm answering.
It's fine. I'm the opposite, whereas I've been the only or one of a few for so long that I just don't care no more. So so they're just like, oh, she loud, she's mad, she's whatever. And I'm just like, oh yeah, you're gonna get this truth today. Let's do it. But I wrote a story a couple of months ago, and the headline was like Kamala the First. It's Kamala the First. It's complicated. That was the headline, and it was about this exact thing that we're talking about: what it means when you're the first, and how it becomes a spectacle. And one of the reasons Krista talked to me is because it wasn't that she was one of a few or a first or any of that that made me interested in her. It was like, I wanted to know her story. Like it's not shocking to me that she's a farmer. She's from the farming belt of California. Like, that wasn't shocking to me, but that she chose to leave California and be in Vermont and to make natural wine, and that she had acres upon acres upon acres, like 55 acres of land. I wanted to know about that. Like, I wasn't caught up in the spectacle. And I told her that right away. She was actually the hardest person to secure for the series. Nobody else was really hard. There were hiccups. There were 2 people who I didn't get to feature because of different coronavirus issues. But Krista was the hardest to secure. I had to actually court her almost. Like, I felt like I was in her DMs trying to woo her, because she was so exhausted from white media making a spectacle of her. And she went and looked me up. And when she saw the work that I do and like read my columns, she was like, oh, nah, I'm gonna talk to you. So it's like, once she realized my point of view and got a taste of the type of stuff I write, she had a little more trust. And then we had a conversation, and she was like, oh yeah, no, I'm gonna talk. I feel good about this. So that's how I secured her. But, I told her right away, in the interview, like, I know what people say. They say like, you're the first, or you're the next, or, oh my God, you're, changing everything. But anytime I see a first, I don't just think, wow, they're the first. I think, wow, how many other people could have done this or had this talent or had this gift, but they weren't given the support or the space. Like, when I see Amanda Gorman, who I wrote about, who is excellent, I also think, I've been to hundreds of poetry nights. I used to host an open mic, and there are hundreds of Amanda Gormans all across the country. She is amazing, and her poem was beautiful. But also, there are lots and lots of amazing young poets, and they just don't get the platform or the support. And that's why I think story is important in telling how people got to where they are, why they do what they do. It's like, of course, Krista is exceptional, and her talent and merit are undeniable. But I think her story of her aunties and her mom and her grandma drinking and talking junk and having cookouts every weekend, her story of being in college and then being like, I'm gonna go back to my grandfather's farm again and learn from the farm that I used to hate being on and learn from him. Her story of like, I want to use this tool of celebration to create legacy. That is a story that makes people realize, yes, Krista is talented and gifted and exceptional, but I now see myself in her, and I can too be this type of exceptional. It's not so out of my reach. I very much love Du Bois, and he said a lot of amazing things about double consciousness and all types of things that I use all the time. I absolutely hate The Talented Tenth, and it is a terrible, we are so stuck on this sad concept of what Black excellence looks like. And it looks like first and onlys and trailblazers. And I'm like, there's people every day living everyday lives doing exceptional things. People like Dart Adams, who someone might be like, oh, Dart, you know, he's like me. I'm a journalist, and it's not like I live an extravagant life and I have millions of followers. But Dart makes such an impact and makes such a difference every day in how he preserves history and culture, his expertise in music. And that to me is excellence. He doesn't have to be like owning 100 acres or making some product everyone can buy. Like, that was one of the things that was important to me about A Beautiful Resistance, is everybody have different types of stories, and that success looked different on all of them. It didn't have to be like Krista's is grand, 55 acres of land, that is grand. But also I made sure Krista talked about the hard days, about, you know, every episode isn't, you know, it's visual, but there's also like a 1,200 word story that accompanies the visual episode so that we could talk about things more nuanced. And, you know, Krista lost a whole crop during the pandemic and could have lost her entire, you know, everything. For farmers, that's everything, to lose a crop. And then Vermont came after her over some really silly things. I mean, it was a lot of drama, and I wanted to make sure that people understood, even when you see people who you think have it all together, particularly Black people, they're still dealing with things. And they still have joy. The things can be, too many things can be true at once. So when telling the stories of first and onlys, it's important to me that we don't get caught up in that trap of elitism and excellence. And it's important to me then when we see a person that is a first, that we think about how are they being supported instead of being made a spectacle of. What is the framework that's going to open a door to leave another? Like when I see Kamala, all I think is, how is this woman being supported? And I know her whole mission is to make sure she leaves the door open behind her, but what is the framework to make sure that's going to happen? What is the framework to make sure the Black and brown women who are, Kamala's not radical, but there are Black and brown women in Congress who are radical. So what is the framework that exists to make sure those women are being heard and they're able to work closely with her? So that's what I think about when I think about these concepts of telling stories of people who are the first and only. I also think about shaming systems where we're still seeing first and onlys.
Yeah, we should not be seeing first and onlys Black people in 2021. I absolutely agree. Switch gears just a little bit. We've gotten some really great questions in the Q&A box, and with 10 minutes left, I want to make sure we get to at least a couple of them. So a question we have from episode 3, Protest is a Beautiful Resistance, was inspiring visually and verbally. Can you elaborate on your thoughts on, quote, love in protests?
To me, protest is a love language. Justice is a love language. Accountability is a love language. And when people, particularly journalists, especially at legacy media, tell the story of protests, the story is always like, a building is burning. Oh, this thing is on fire. People were violent. And, you know, one of the most annoying moments for me over the last several months was I went to this protest in Boston, and it was beautiful, and we marched, and it was peaceful. The protest ended, and within 45 minutes of the end of the protest, violence happened and looting. And that became the story, and it was attached to the story of the protest. It was just like, let's not even talk about the protest, let's just talk about this. And they acted like these broken windows and clothes were more important than actual dead bodies. And I'll never forget, there was this white woman on TV, a journalist, And she was standing in the street while teenagers were running in and out of Concepts, stealing shoes. And Concepts, by the way, didn't care about this. They like made a statement saying they cared more about Black lives and people and things can be replaced. Urban Grape did the same thing. But there's a white lady standing there. Nobody's touching her. Nobody's threatening her. Nobody's fighting each other. And footage would later reveal it was police that actually incited violence against protesters that evening. Like there's whole videos that show it. And she's like, I'm so scared. And I was like, of what? Nobody's touching you. No one's looking at you. No one's coming near you. No one's fighting each other. It's like the window has already been broken. The door is open. People are legitimately just running in and out with shoes. I'm not saying that that is okay, but I'm also saying it's not the violence she tried to make it either. Like violence is people who can't eat and pay their bills and who don't have homes, who can't get health care. Violence is not you standing in the street quite comfortably with a whole camera crew and kids they're not even touching you, like not even looking at you.
Not paying you any mind.
Not paying you any mind at all. And it was just, that moment made me so frustrated because I was like, I'd been there all day before any of this happened. The protest was long over and all the headlines made it seem like this day-long protest was just debauchery and violence. And the same thing in Minneapolis when they set the empty police, like none of the police got hurt. There were no police in that precinct when it went up on fire. And that became the story. Like this police precinct is on fire. Oh my God, I've never seen anything like this in my life. I'm like, you never see anything like George Floyd get lynched in your life. But you talking about this burning building where ain't nobody hurt, and that's what you want me to care about. So when I talk about protest as a love language, I'm thinking about the other side of that so-called violence, which is typically property damage. Black people have been treated like commodities always in this country, always. America puts God on our money because money is our God. And I don't mean that as any individual in this room, I mean it as a country. And that is why the stories are the way they are. They're like, look at this destruction when it's not people being hurt, but it's buildings or property being stolen. We talked more about that than we did about journalists who lost eyeballs from police violence, police who created violence that permanently damaged journalists and everyday citizens alike who were protesting. We talk more about that than we do about the way people gave each other water and hand sanitizer and masks, how people protested in the middle of a pandemic with masks safely, and those weren't the breeding grounds for the pandemic as epidemiologists were able to show. We don't talk about the way people dance and double dutch and just literally jump rope straight through the streets, how the artists come out and they give flowers. That, on Juneteenth in DC, they had a go-go. They had a whole like old school go-go, and that was their protest. And I'm like, we don't talk about the beauty, the joy, and the love of Blackness, the love of each other, the love of culture, the togetherness, the intersectionality. And that is why I focused that episode on protest as a love language in the community I've seen when I'm out there marching. I don't feel scared when I'm out there. I feel loved. I feel held. I feel taken care of. I know what it is to have a sister of the Calabash sage me and pour water on me when it's 100 degrees outside. Like, that is such a thing of beauty. And it annoys me that media falls victim to like, let's just go for the violence. I'm like, no, violence is what you saw happen at the Capitol. They wanted to kill people. If Black people acted like that, every last one of them would have been in jail or dead. Likely dead, because they would have brought out the military and they would have just used machine guns and shot them all. And that was such a perfect example of how we frame stories around. They didn't even want to call that a terrorist attack or even violence. They kept trying to use real soft, easy words. And I was just like, because they white? Like, I'm confused. So, sorry, that was a really long way to answer that question.
No, that's wonderful. Gwyneth,
Yeah.
thoughts on protests?
Hmm?
Did you have some thoughts on protests you wanted to share?
No, just, the protests I've been to, it's like you're saying, it's so joyful, it's so generous, um, and to see it always framed as violence. It seems like, no matter what we do, the mainstream story is to stick us in trauma. So we were talking about that earlier, that it keeps revisiting the trauma. And so I loved seeing this sharing of beauty in the protests.
Yeah, I agree. It was not something that I had even thought about. One of my brothers lives and works in Los Angeles. He works for the city of LA, and he was out there for the first time. He's like, I actually have to work with police, like working to set up these barricades and whatnot for the protests. And so I hear, how he is feeling about it from that side of getting ready for them. And then of course we see in the media what they show. And so to see it's three sides to every story, at least. So to see this third side of what you were describing and what you show about people loving on each other and taking care of each other in a way that it's just different. It's not really describable if you don't see it or experience it for yourself. I've never been in a protest, but I felt like watching some of the footage that you provided and through the pictures that OJ provided was really seeing that third side that's not talked about. And not to beat a dead horse, but it really goes back to show like how we need to be sharing our own stories and how we need to be the ones telling what happened, because there's always that one side, that trauma and that pain and that violence that's always going to be showed. That's what gets ratings. That's what gets people paid, but that's not the whole story. And then that in turn affects us as Black people as we live our lives, where we are seen as threats and we are seen as perpetuators of violence. And if that's all you see on TV, and you live in a community like ours that is like, I don't know, 96% white, what do you expect people to think of you if that's all they ever see? And so I think A Beautiful Resistance overall is gorgeous. And I'm very glad to hear that it's going to be continuing, and I will encourage everyone to continue watching. And I think it's going to be an integral part of how we share our stories in the future, and something that we can show of this is how you share our stories. One, you let us share our stories, but also you share all of us as a person.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being with us. And I just realized it's 12:59.
I do want to, if I can just thank you again, not only for the work, but for what you, when you quoted Audre Lorde with the idea of shared joy building bridges. I think it's just such a beautiful concept to not only nourish ourselves and recharge, because it has been such a destructive and draining year. And the series was one of the things that did feed me and was able to give me energy back. And I appreciate that deeply. But the idea of these stories building bridges is also beautiful.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's so great to be here. One last thing I want to say, which I wish I could say something more joyous. Actually, I will end with something more joyous, but I want to say this one thing before I say the joyous thing is, as I talk about love and protest, I also want to be clear that if I'm angry because we continue to be brutalized, that is a love language. I'm tired of our anger being weaponized against us and us being told to turn the other cheek as we are dying. And, what happened at the Capitol, white people were mad about what? An election? Like, they lost an election. We actually are being murdered. We are losing access. Some of the accesses and inequities we have, those same white people suffer from, but they chose supremacy over working with us when a lot of the things they want are things we want. And it's insane to me how their anger, which is actually not justified and is rooted in chaos and confusion, gets sympathy in storylines that kind of feed into like, oh, they were taken by QAnon and given all this misinformation where our anger is rooted in legitimate brutality. And we're told we're being violent. And they're actually trying to kill people. And people are trying to explain it away and reason it. And that's one thing I wanted just to add to the Protest is a Love Language, because all of the things I said are real. There's joy, there's beauty, but also like we are entitled to our righteous anger and it is righteous. And the thing I'll say to leave everyone on a more joyous note is I find in being Black a thing of beauty, a joy, a strength, a secret cup of gladness. And that's my favorite Ossie Davis quote to say all the time. So thank you all for having me. This has been a lovely conversation.
Well, we really appreciate you being here with us. Thank you so much. And I will just close with a shameless plug that we do have one more Black History Month program next Wednesday at noon, a presentation by Mr. Wesley Jarman titled, "Why is Ernest Everest Just So Important to Black History Month?" So please visit our website to register for that. We also have links to Jeneé's A Beautiful Resistance on the website. Definitely encourage you to watch them if you haven't already. Follow on Instagram, and we look forward to seeing what comes in the future.
And share recipes and photos on the virtual Harambe.
Yes, well, thank you. All right, thank you all so much. Take care.